Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Old Testament. So, to start off with, we're going to talk about the topics for today, which consist of the components of the Old Testament, approaching the Old Testament while reading it, a little bit about hermeneutics, and just a little bit about the canonization process for the Old Testament. So, to begin, the Old Testament is composed of 39 books, and it's conveniently broken down into 5 different categories, just like the New Testament, beginning with the Pentateuch or Torah, which consist of the law books, which are given to the people of Israel for them to follow to be in covenant with God. Another purpose of the Torah is to reveal God's holiness, His character, His justice, and how desperately we need God. And then, second, we see the history books, which are the history of the people of Israel. And then we see the poetry and wisdom books, which have so much to offer us today. Like in the book of Psalms, we see the psalmist in times of mourning and rejoicing and confusion and just crying out to God. And I feel like they're very just applicable for people and things that we still deal with today. And then we see the major and minor prophets. And the prophets are how God chose to speak important messages to his people, messages of warning or encouragement, and messages of the coming Messiah. So now we're going to move on to talking about approaching the Old Testament. And so when reading the Old Testament, we see that one, it is God's self-revelation. We see how God is just revealing himself to us. He's telling us what he's like. And if he didn't do this, we would have to guess, which I don't think would go very well. But we also see in revealing himself to us, he gives us the option and is hoping that we will enter into a relationship with him. And second, we see God's invitation, which this is just his invitation to us to hear his story. And through hearing people's stories, that's how we get to know people. So that's how we get to know God. And then thirdly, we see his attributes in action. And so it's one thing for God to tell us that he's faithful or that he's loving or that he cares about us. But for us to see that in action shows that he's truly like that. So lastly, we see God's covenant, and we see through this that God, his desire is to be with his people. We see this in an example in the garden with Adam and Eve, and then through the covenant that God makes with Abraham. We see this in Exodus of God rescuing his people from slavery, and in the tabernacle as his presence goes with them everywhere that they go. And in the New Testament, we see this through the incarnation in Jesus. And then we see this at Pentecost when he pours out his Holy Spirit. And then ultimately in the end of Revelation, we see the new creation. So we see from the beginning of the Garden of Eden to the end of Revelation how it is just one big story of God desiring to be with his people. And then just a few questions and methods to applying the Old Testament to our life today. One question is, what does this teach me about God and his character? And then another question would be, how can I learn from this text? So a little bit about hermeneutics and why this is important to the Old Testament is hermeneutics is how we study the Bible. And so a few things under the topic of hermeneutics is understanding the context in which the Old Testament was written. It was written, thousands of years ago when people were living in very different times and settings than we were, but that doesn't mean that it's not applicable to us today. And so the second thing is determining the literature type. So there are so many different types of literature all throughout the Bible. There's poetry, there's stories, there's narrative, apocalyptic writing, and prophecy. And so it's important to determine the literature style because there are things that are meant to be taken literally, and there are things that are meant to be taken figuratively. And it's important in understanding what is literal and what is figurative in determining the literature type. Because if you take something literal that was meant to be figurative, could completely change your theology and where you stand on a subject. And so lastly, we have the process of canonization, which is just a little bit different than the process for the New Testament. And so the main thing is who wrote it. And so in determining who wrote it, it needs to be by a prophet or by another spirit-led person. And this is important for the Old Testament because in the time of the Old Testament, God's Spirit was not given to every person like it is today. It was given to a specific person for a specific time or a specific time period to speak a message to God's people. And then the second thing is to who was it written, and this needs to be written to all generations. And then lastly, in accord with what? It needs to be written in accordance with previous revelations. And so that brings us to the end of our time together in talking about the Old Testament. Thank you for your time, and I hope that this was informational and helpful.